There are moments in a man's life that don't announce themselves. They don't come with a warning or a drum roll or any of the signs you'd think would accompany something that changes everything. They come quiet, like a back door opening, like a window letting in cold air you didn't know you needed. This is a story about one of those moments. It's about the worst Saturday night I'd had in years and what happened when I walked through my own front door after it. I told her my date had turned me down, and she looked at me, not with pity, not with surprise, but with something steadier than either of those things. And she said, "I wouldn't have turned you down." I didn't know what to do with that, not at first. I stood there in the entryway of that little rented house in Mill Haven, Indiana, still wearing my good flannel shirt with the collar too stiff and my boots that I'd actually polished for once, and I felt the whole world tilt about 3 degrees to the left on its axis. She went back to her book like she hadn't just rearranged something fundamental inside my chest. It took me a long time to understand what she meant. Or maybe I understood right away and just needed time to believe it. Either way, this is how it started. My name is Cal Merritt. I was 34 years old. I'd spent the last 11 years driving 18-wheelers from one edge of this country to the other, and I hadn't done much else. My CDL license had more hours on it than some men put into marriages. I knew every truck stop between Louisville and Spokane, every diner that left a pot of coffee on the counter at 3 a.m., every stretch of highway that looked exactly the same for 200 miles, and then, without warning, opened up into something that made you think God was showing off. I loved the road. I want to say that plainly. I wasn't running from anything, not at first. I was just a man who fit better in a cab than in a living room, and that particular arrangement had suited me fine for a long time. Then my dad had a stroke. He was 61 years old, which felt too young, and he lived alone in Mill Haven, which is a town of about 4,200 people situated in the southern part of Indiana, the kind of place where the grain elevator is the tallest building and the high school football team draws a bigger crowd than anything else that happens there between September and November. I'd grown up there, left at 22, came back in March of that year when the hospital called, and my mother, who had passed 8 years earlier, wasn't there to go instead. Dad recovered, slowly, haltingly, the way a man that stubborn recovers, on his own terms and at about half the speed his doctor recommended. But he recovered enough that by April he didn't need me sleeping on his couch anymore. That left me in Mill Haven with no job, no plan, and a 2009 Chevy pickup with 163,000 miles on it, parked in front of a house I didn't own. The house was on Sycamore Street, 2 blocks off the main drag. I was renting it from a man named Harold Peck, who'd inherited it from his mother and had no desire to live in it or fix it up or do anything with it except deposit a check on the first of each month. It had a wide front porch with a wooden swing that needed one new chain and a south-facing exposure that caught the afternoon light so well that almost made the peeling paint look intentional. I loved that porch immediately. I didn't love much about being off the road, but I loved that porch. The house had 2 bedrooms. I couldn't afford both halves of the rent on my own. I had some savings, but I'd spent most of my road money helping Dad cover his hospital deductibles. So I put a note up at the diner on Main Street and waited. Linda Callahan answered it 6 days later. She showed up on a Tuesday evening in late April, and I remember the light was that particular shade of pale gold that southern Indiana gets in the late afternoon in spring, where everything looks both warmer and more fragile than it actually is. I was on the porch with a cup of coffee when she pulled up in a red Civic that had a crack running from the bottom of the passenger window halfway up the glass and a back bumper held on with what I later learned was a length of nylon rope she'd found at a gas station in Terre Haute. She was 29 years old. She had dark brown hair cut just below her chin and the dark eyes that could be warm or serious depending on what she needed them to be. She was wearing jeans and a green canvas jacket, and she was carrying a canvas tote bag,
and she looked like a woman who had packed exactly what she needed and nothing extra. She walked up to the porch steps and looked up at me. "You're the one who put up the note at Hazel's?" Hazel's was what most people called the Main Street Diner, after the woman who'd owned it for 30 years.
"That's me," I said. "I'm Linda. I just moved back here. I'm working the breakfast and lunch shift at Hazel's starting next week." She paused. "I'll be quiet, I'll pay on time, and I won't eat your food." I liked the directness of that. I showed her the room. She moved in on Friday. We were strangers for about 2 weeks, which is natural. She kept odd hours, in by 9 from the diner, up before 5. I kept odder ones, since I was working part-time at my buddy Darren's garage on Elm Street, picking up mechanic work I'd learned between trucking jobs and never done full-time. We overlapped in the kitchen sometimes. We said good morning. We talked about the water heater once when it started making a noise like a man clearing his throat. Then, one night in early May, there was a storm. Not a dangerous one, just a long, slow Indiana rainstorm that came in around dusk and didn't leave until nearly midnight. We both ended up on the porch because neither of us wanted to be inside while the thunder rolled through, and that was when we actually talked. I learned that she'd been in Indianapolis for 6 years, working for an event planning company. I learned that she'd left because of something she kept the edges of deliberately vague, something that involved a business partner and a lease and a pretty significant amount of money that wasn't coming back. I learned she had a younger sister in Millhaven, that she'd grown up 2 streets over from me without us ever really knowing each other, and that she had a way of saying hard things plainly without making them sound like complaints. She learned that I'd been on the road most of my adult life, that I wasn't sure what I was doing in Millhaven long term, and that I made decent coffee. "High praise in this town," she said, and smiled for the first time, and I noticed the way it changed her whole face. We sat on that porch until nearly 11. The rain kept coming, and we kept talking, and I thought by the time I finally went inside that I had not talked that long with another person in a very long time. We were something like friends after that, the kind that don't have to announce themselves. In June, my buddy Pete Walsh asked me if I wanted to come to a cookout he was throwing at his place out on Route 9. He had a younger sister named Diane who worked in insurance up in Columbus and was home for the summer, and Pete had been not quite subtly suggesting I should meet her for about 3 weeks. I went mostly to keep the peace. Diane was pleasant. She was smart, and she dressed nicely, and she laughed at all the right moments. We talked for a couple of hours, and she seemed to enjoy herself, and when Pete pulled me aside near the end of the night and said she'd mentioned she wouldn't mind if I called her sometime, I figured, why not? I was 34 years old, I was putting down something resembling roots for the first time in my adult life, and it seemed like the kind of step a man in that situation was supposed to take. I asked Diane to dinner the following Saturday. She said yes. I borrowed a nicer shirt from Darren. I polished my boots. I drove to Hazel's Diner on Main Street because it was the best restaurant in Millhaven, which I recognized might not be saying a great deal, but the food was genuinely good and the booths in the back were private enough. Linda was working. She brought us water and gave me a look I couldn't quite read, not a smile exactly, but something in the neighborhood. She was professional and easy and refilled the coffee without being asked, the way she always did, and I concentrated on my dinner. It did not go well. I don't know exactly how to explain what happens when 2 people sit across a table from each other and discover there is simply no current between them. Diane was fine. I was probably fine too from the outside. But we talked about the weather in Columbus and her insurance territory and the new highway bypass they were building outside of town, and by the time the food came, we had both quietly acknowledged, I think, that this was going nowhere at any speed. She was kind about it. That's the thing I want to say. She wasn't cold or rude. She just said toward the end of the meal, with a look that was almost apologetic, "Cal, I think you're a good man. I just don't think—" and she made a small gesture with her hand that covered everything she needed to say. I paid the check. I walked her to her car.
I drove home. Linda was on the porch when I got back. It was about 9:30. The porch light was on, that old amber bulb over the door that I'd replaced when I moved in because the previous one flickered. She had her feet up on the railing and a paperback open in her lap. She looked up when I came up the porch steps, still in my borrowed shirt, still in my polished boots, still wearing what I imagined was a pretty obvious expression on my face. She didn't say anything for a moment, just looked at me.
"How'd it go?" she finally asked. I sat down on the porch swing. The chain I'd never gotten around to replacing creaked the way it always did. "She turned me down," I said. I wasn't trying to be dramatic about it. I was just tired. Linda closed her book slowly. She set it on the small table between the two chairs, and she looked at me with those dark eyes in the amber porch light. And she was quiet for just a breath longer than felt comfortable. Then she said, "I wouldn't have turned you down." She said it quietly, not flirtatiously, not coyly, just plainly, the way she said everything, like it was a fact she was sharing, like it was information she thought I probably deserved to have. I stared at her. She picked her book back up. "Linda," I said. "Cal," she said without looking up, "what does that mean?" She turned a page, or pretended to. "It means what it means." I sat there for a long time after that, not saying anything, and the night insects were loud in the elm tree at the corner of the porch, and down on Sycamore Street a car passed slow, and the porch light was warm against the dark, and I felt like a man who has been standing next to a door for months and has only just now noticed it was unlocked the entire time. I didn't sleep well that night. I lay in bed in my room on the east side of the house. I could hear the elm tree brushing the side window in the light wind, and I thought about Linda Callahan. I thought about the 2 months we'd been living in that house, about the storm in May when we'd talked until 11, about the way she'd started leaving half a pot of coffee on when she came home from her early shift because she knew I'd be up around 7. About the way she'd handed me a dish towel when I was trying to dry my hands on my jeans and just said quietly and without judgment, "There are easier ways." I thought about the look she'd given me when I walked into Hazel's with Diane. I thought about the way she'd said it. "I wouldn't have turned you down." Past tense, conditional, like she'd thought about it and arrived at a conclusion some time ago and was only now choosing to share it and might or might not do anything more with the information, depending on what I did next. The thing about spending 11 years on the road is you get good at reading stillness. You learn when a highway is just quiet and when it's about to give you trouble. You learn the difference between weather and weather. I had been so focused on the obvious thing, on the thing that Pete Walsh was gently pushing me toward, that I had completely missed the door standing open right beside me. Or, not missed, maybe I'd seen it and not trusted myself to walk through it. That was closer to the truth. The next morning I was up before her, which was unusual. I made a full pot of coffee and I was sitting at the kitchen table when she came through in her work clothes, her canvas bag over her shoulder, her hair still a little damp from the shower. She stopped when she saw me. "You're up early." "Couldn't sleep." She looked at me for a moment, then moved to the counter and poured herself a travel cup. She was quiet while she did it. "Linda," I said. "Cal," she said. "I want to talk about what you said." She put the lid on her cup. She turned around and leaned against the counter and looked at me with an expression I had learned by then meant she was choosing her words carefully. "I don't want to make anything weird," she said. "I live here. You live here. It was an honest thing and I meant it, but I'm not asking you for anything." "I know you're not. That's not what I mean." "Then what do you mean?" I didn't have a clean answer. I was a man who'd spent his adult life driving straight lines, and I was sitting in a kitchen trying to explain something curved. "I mean," I said finally, that I think I want to ask you to dinner. Not at Hazel's, somewhere you're not working." She was quiet for a moment. The refrigerator hummed. Outside the kitchen window, a robin was going at something in the yard. "Okay," she said. "Okay, yes, or okay, you heard me?" The corner of her mouth moved, just barely. "Okay, yes, Cal." She went to work. I sat there for a while with my coffee, feeling something unclench in my chest that had been tight for longer than I could account for. I should have known it wouldn't be simple. The dinner went well. We drove to a place called the Fieldstone over in Greenburgh, which was 40 minutes away, and had tablecloths and a wine list and candles, and I felt overdressed and underdressed simultaneously, which seemed about right. Linda wore a dark blue dress I'd never seen before. She looked different outside of the house, outside of her work clothes and her canvas bag, and the particular way she inhabited shared domestic space.
She looked like herself, but also like a version of herself I hadn't met yet. We talked the way we always talked, easy, direct, with long pauses that neither of us felt the need to fill. She told me more about Indianapolis, about the business partner who had taken a client list and half a deposit fund and left her holding a lease on a commercial kitchen space she couldn't afford. She told me she'd come back to Millhaven because she was broke, and because her sister was here, and because she hadn't been able to think of anywhere else that felt like she had a right to land. I told her about the road, about the particular silence of a 3 a.m. highway in the desert, about the way I'd started calling my dad from truck stops, long calls that neither of us was very good at, just to hear his voice outside the cab, about how I hadn't expected to feel anything but restless when I came back to Indiana, and how the town had surprised me. "How?" she asked. "It still feels like mine," I said. "I didn't think it would. I thought I'd burned that out a long time ago." She looked at me across the candlelit table with that steady, measuring expression. "I know exactly what you mean," she said. On the drive home, somewhere between Greenburgh and Millhaven on the dark state highway, she reached over and set her hand on top of mine on the gear shift. She didn't say anything. I turned my hand over and held hers. That was how it started. Quietly. The way it should. For a while it was good in the uncomplicated way that things are good when they're new and warm, and neither person has pushed on the walls yet. Linda and I had our rhythms already. They'd been built in without either of us trying, and adding this new thing to them didn't disrupt them so much as deepen them. We still had our coffee mornings. She still worked early shifts at Hazel's. I still went to Darren's garage 4 days a week, which had by now turned into something more than part-time, as word got around that I did good work and didn't overcharge. I'd started picking up enough to keep the lights on without eating too deep into my savings, and Darren had mentioned something about a partnership if things kept going the way they were. Evenings on the porch became the architecture of our days. We'd sit out there after dinner, her in the wicker chair, me on the swing, and watch the light go out of the sky over Sycamore Street. Sometimes we talked a lot, and sometimes we barely talked at all, and both felt exactly the same. I fixed the swing chain in July, replaced the whole thing with a proper galvanized chain I got from the hardware store on 2nd Avenue. I did it on a Thursday afternoon when Linda was at work, and when she came home and saw it, she stood at the bottom of the porch steps and looked at it for a moment without saying anything. "It stopped creaking," she said. "It did." "I kinda liked the creak," she said, and there was something soft under the words. "I'll put it back if you want." She laughed, which was one of my favorite sounds that summer, and came up the steps and sat down on the swing beside me instead of in her usual chair, which was new, and we sat there together, with the chain not creaking, and it was fine. Better than fine. In August, her sister Maggie came to the house. Maggie Callahan was 26, 3 years younger than Linda, and she was direct in the way that people are direct when they've decided to use it as a first defense. She came over for dinner on a Friday night, and she was polite to me in the way you're polite to a man you're not sure of yet. She helped with the dishes afterward without being asked, and she and Linda talked in the kitchen while I sat on the porch, and I could hear the low register of a serious conversation without being able to make out the words. When Linda came out later, after Maggie had left, she sat down beside me on the swing and was quiet for a minute. "What did she say?" I asked. "She asked how serious it is." "And what did you tell her?" Linda looked out to Sycamore Street, at the orange streetlight on the corner. "I told her I didn't know yet, that it was early." She paused. "She thinks I need to be careful. She thinks I have a pattern of trusting people I shouldn't." I thought about that. Is she wrong? About the pattern, no. About you, I don't know yet. That's what I told her. That honesty was one of the things I most valued about Linda. She wasn't soft about the truth. She didn't sugarcoat the uncertain parts, but she also didn't weaponize them. "Fair enough," I said. "It's not fair or unfair. It's just where we are." I nodded. We sat there for a while. The porch light was on, and the moths were doing their determined, pointless work against the glass. "I'm not going anywhere," I said. It wasn't a grand statement. It was just the most accurate thing I could say. She was quiet for a moment. Then she leaned over and put her head against my shoulder, which she hadn't done before, and didn't say anything.
That felt like something. In September, the thing that complicated everything walked through the door of Darren's garage on Tuesday morning. His name was Greg Harlow. He was 42, from Indianapolis, and he had recently moved back to Millhaven to take care of his aging mother, which was the same story half the people in town seemed to be living that year. He was tall and well-dressed in a way that read as money, not ostentatious, but solid, the kind of quality that came from having had it long enough to not need to show it. He drove a late-model truck that needed a new alternator, which is how he ended up at the garage. He came back for the truck on Wednesday, and he and Darren chatted while I worked, and he was charming in the easy way that some men are, the kind that doesn't cost them anything. I didn't think much of him until I mentioned, in passing, that I was renting on Sycamore Street, and he said, "That little gray house, the one with the porch swing?" "That's the one," I said. "I know that house," he said. "I grew up down the block from it." A pause. "Does a Linda still waitress at Hazel's?" I looked at him directly. "She does." He smiled, and something in the smile was private, like a door closing on a room I hadn't known existed. "We went to high school together," he said. "Her and I go way back." I found out from Maggie, not from Linda, that Greg Harlow and Linda had dated their senior year of high school and for a while after graduation, that they'd talked about getting married, that he ended it when he left for college and Linda hadn't, and that it had not been a gentle ending. Linda didn't mention any of this. What she did do was come home from a Wednesday shift looking like she had a harder day than usual, and when I asked, she said, "Greg Harlow came into the diner." "I know," I said. "He brought his truck in." She looked at me. "You didn't say." I didn't know if it mattered. She set her bag down on the kitchen counter and stood there with her back to me for a moment. "It doesn't," she said. "It was a long time ago." "Okay," I said. She turned around. Her expression was carefully neutral. "Are you going for coffee with him?" "No," she said, and then, quieter, "I'm not." She picked up her bag and went to her room, and I stood in the kitchen for a while, and the refrigerator hummed, and the robin that had been working the yard all summer was out there still, going at something in the grass. October came, and the trees went red and gold along Sycamore Street, and my dad had a good stretch, the best he'd had since March, and I started driving out to see him twice a week instead of once. I'd bring him dinner sometimes, or we'd just sit in his living room and watch the game with the sound down, the way we'd always watched things, side by side and not talking much, but together, which was its own language. One Thursday, I brought Linda with me. I hadn't planned to.
She'd been in the truck when I left. I was dropping her off at her sister's on the way, and she said, when I stopped in front of Maggie's house, "I'll come with you, if that's all right." I looked at her. "You sure?" "I'd like to meet him," she said. My dad, his name was Roy Merritt, and he was 61 years old and stubborn as a fence post, and cried twice that I had witnessed in my entire life, opened the door and looked at Linda for a moment, and then looked at me, and something passed between us that didn't need words.
"Come on in," he said, in his dry, flat Indiana voice. "I'll put on coffee." He liked her. I could tell, because he talked. My dad did not talk to people he didn't like. He was polite to them, efficiently, and without warmth, and he talked to them about nothing. He talked to Linda about the farm his dad had run outside of town, about the particular quality of soil in that part of Indiana, about a dog he had when he was 12. He talked to her for 2 hours while I sat to the side and watched, and when we left and I helped him to the door, he gripped my arm and looked at me and said, quiet enough that only I could hear, "She's a good one, Cal." In the truck, on the way back, Linda was quiet for a while, and then she said, "He has a good soul." I said, "He does." "You got it from him," she said, and looked out the window at the dark Indiana highway. In November, the thing with Linda's business came up. She'd been talking, in the offhand way she talked about things she was still deciding, about the commercial kitchen space she'd lost in Indianapolis. Not the specific one, but the idea of it. The possibility of doing event catering in Millhaven, which had no dedicated caterer, and was constantly sending its weddings and reunions and church dinners out to companies in Greenburgh or Columbus. She'd mentioned it to Hazel, who owned the diner, and Hazel had mentioned that the back room, a larger space that they'd been using for storage since the banquet business dried up years ago, was sitting empty, and she wasn't opposed to an arrangement. The problem was the equipment. Linda's catering setup, the professional warming trays, the serving tables, the portable coolers, was in a storage unit in Indianapolis, held against an unpaid balance she hadn't been able to clear. The balance was $840. She told me this on the porch on a cold November night, which we'd started outfitting with a small propane heater so we could keep sitting out there as the weather turned. She told me in that way she had of presenting a problem plainly, without inflection, like she was reading it off a page. "What are you going to do?" I asked. "I don't know yet," she said. "Maggie offered to help, but she doesn't have it either. I thought maybe I could negotiate with the storage company, but they've already gone to collection." I thought for a moment. I had the savings. I'd been careful with my road money over the years, and while most of it had gone to Dad's hospital bills, I had what I needed. But I also knew Linda well enough by then to know that offering money directly would not land the way I meant it. "Let me call the storage company," I said. She looked at me. "You're not paying my debts," she said. "I'm not paying them, I'm negotiating them. That's different work, and it's what I'm actually good at." That part was true. 11 years dealing with freight brokers and dispatch and trucking companies had given me a particular skill set when it came to people who wanted money. You pay me back when the catering business is up and you can. There's no timeline. She was quiet for a long time. The propane heater hummed between us. "Why?" she asked. I looked at her directly. "Because I want to see what you build," I said. "Because I think you're going to build something good." She looked at me for a long moment with an expression I couldn't entirely read, and then she said, quietly, "All right." I called the storage company the next day. We settled at $620. Her equipment was on a truck to Millhaven by Friday. I spent the following Saturday building her a set of shelving units in Hazel's back room, clean pine boards from the lumber yard on Route 9, properly mounted and level, and she spent that same Saturday organizing the space, and we worked next to each other most of the day without talking much, and at the end of it we stood in the doorway of that back room, and the diner was quiet around us, and the main street light came through the front windows, and I thought, this is what I was on the road toward, without ever knowing it.
This is the place I was driving to. In November, my dad had a second episode. It was smaller than the first, the doctors said it was minor, said the damage was limited and he'd recover again, but it scared me in a way the first hadn't, because I'd had more time by then to understand what losing him would mean. I was at the hospital in Greenberg for 3 days straight, sleeping in the family waiting room, eating from the vending machine, trying to field calls from his neighbor and his doctor and my mother's sister out in Ohio. Linda came every day. She didn't stay in the waiting room the whole time. She had her shifts, she had a catering inquiry she was trying to nail down, she had her life.
But she came every day. She brought real food, not vending machine food. She sat with me for an hour each time and didn't try to fill the silence with reassurance. She was just there. On the third night, sitting in those plastic waiting room chairs under the fluorescent lights at about 10 o'clock, she fell asleep on my shoulder. I sat very still and let her sleep. I looked up at the ceiling tiles and thought about the road, which I still did sometimes, not with longing anymore, but with a kind of fond distance, the way you think about a place you loved and left. I thought about all the nights I'd slept in a truck cab, alone and fine with it, and I thought about the specific weight of this woman's head on my shoulder and what it meant that I never wanted to not have it there. Dad came home 4 days before Christmas. I brought him to Sycamore Street for Christmas dinner. Me and Dad and Linda and Maggie in that little rented house with the peeling paint and the fixed porch swing. And Linda made a ham, and Maggie brought a pie, and my dad sat at the head of the table and told a story about a tractor pull he'd been in when he was 19 that had us all laughing. And I sat at that table and felt something I hadn't felt in so long I'd almost stopped believing it was real. I felt like I was exactly where I was supposed to be. January came cold and clear, and I started thinking about the ring. It wasn't a sudden decision. It was a slow accumulation, the way all the real decisions are. You don't choose them so much as arrive at them after the road has already taken you there. I knew what I felt. I knew what we were. The question was timing and execution, both of which I have historically not been good at. I talked to Dad about it on a Thursday visit. He was doing better. He'd started going to his physical therapy without arguing, which his doctor said was a minor miracle of character development. He listened to me without interrupting, which was its own form of support. "She's the one?" he asked. "Yeah," I said. "She is." He was quiet for a moment. Then he got up and went to his bedroom and came back with a small box, dark blue velvet, the kind that has been sitting in a drawer for long enough that the velvet has gone a bit soft. I opened it. A simple gold band with a small round diamond, modest and warm and real. "You're sure?" I asked. "It's been in that drawer for 23 years, he said. "It can live somewhere better." I took it home. She almost walked away in February. I want to be honest about this. We had been circling something for a few weeks, a tension I couldn't name, something underneath our easy rhythms that was starting to strain. I'd been putting in long days at the garage as the partnership deal finalized, and I'd been distracted and short in the ways that tired people get short. And Linda had been doing the same, building her catering business from nothing while still pulling diner shifts, and we were both running at capacity in a way that made the small things larger. The fight, if you can call it a fight, which is maybe too dramatic a word for two quiet people, happened on a Sunday night in mid-February. She'd had a catering job fall through, a booking she'd been counting on, and she came home already wrung out, and I said something thoughtless about her availability, about a dinner we'd planned that she'd rescheduled for the third time. I didn't mean it the way it landed, but it landed hard. She went to her room and closed the door, and I sat on the porch in the February cold, which I deserved, and thought about what I'd said and what was underneath it, which was fear. The plain, uncomplicated fear that I was better at maintaining distance than building nearness,
that 11 years on the road had made me someone who didn't know how to do this well, that she deserved someone who did. It was very cold. The porch light was on, amber against the winter dark, and the street was empty and quiet. I heard the front door open about an hour after I'd come out. She sat down on the swing beside me. She was wearing her heavy coat, and her breath came out in little clouds. "I almost called Maggie to come get me," she said. "I know," I said. "I'm sorry. She's not going to stay if it keeps feeling like I'm bothering you." Her voice was steady, but the edges of it were close to something. "You're not bothering me," I said. "You're the only thing that isn't work." She was quiet. "What I said was stupid, and I meant something different. What I meant is that I miss you. Even when you're in the next room, I miss the version of us that has time. I'm not good at saying that directly, apparently." She looked at me for a long moment in the porch light. "You could try saying things directly. I've heard it's useful." "I'm practicing," I said. She leaned into me.
The swing didn't creak anymore, which I now considered one of my finest achievements. "Don't do that again," she said. "I won't," I said. We sat there in the cold for a while, and the porch light held us in its little amber circle against the February dark, and I thought about how that light was the first thing she'd see when she pulled up in her Civic after a long shift, and how that was not an accident, how I made sure it was always on. That was when I knew for certain it was time. I asked her on a Friday evening in early March. No restaurant, no public, just the porch, at the end of the day, when the light was that pale gold again, and the first real smell of spring was in the air. She came home from her shift, and I was on the porch, which was not unusual, and she came up the steps with her canvas bag, which was not unusual, and I said, "Sit down a minute," which gave me away completely, because she looked at me immediately with that measuring expression. "Cal," she said slowly. "Just sit down," I said. She sat on the swing. I sat beside her. I held the little blue velvet box in my hands, and I said, "This was my mother's ring. My dad gave it to me because he thought it should be somewhere it means something, and I think—" I stopped, started again. "I'm not good at this kind of thing. I've spent most of my life getting better at being alone than being with people, but I'm better when I'm with you. I'm better at everything, and I don't want to be good at being alone anymore." She was looking at the ring. "Linda," I said, "I wouldn't have turned you down either." She looked up at me fast when I said that. Her eyes were bright. "I wouldn't have then, and I wouldn't now," I said. "That's what I should have said that night on the porch. I just didn't know it yet." She reached out and touched the ring in the box with one finger, very gently. Then she looked at me with those dark eyes that could be warm or serious, and right then they were both at once. "Yes," she said, quietly, simply, the way she said everything. "Yes," she said again, like she wanted to say it twice. 6 months later, on a Saturday morning in early September, I was on the porch with a cup of coffee when the Civic pulled into the driveway. It still had the cracked passenger window. I'd offered to replace it, and she'd said she'd gotten attached to it. I had stopped arguing because I had learned over the course of our life together when arguing was useful and when it wasn't. She came up the porch steps in jeans and the green canvas jacket, the same one she'd been wearing the first time she walked up those steps, though it had seen better days since. She had a paper bag from Hazel's in her hand, breakfast sandwiches, because it was Saturday, and Saturday we didn't cook. The ring was on her finger. It had been on her finger since March, and I never got tired of seeing it there. She sat there on the swing beside me and opened the bag and handed me a sandwich, and we sat there for a while in the September morning, watching the elm tree do its slow September work in the yard. The house was ours now. Harold Peck had decided to sell, and we had enough between the garage partnership and the catering business to make an offer that held up. The porch was going to need new boards on the south end before winter. I was planning to do it myself, which was a different kind of satisfaction than paying someone else, and a better one.
Linda's catering business had 3 standing monthly contracts and a calendar booked through to Christmas. She had hired a part-time assistant, a young woman named Cara, who had a culinary degree from Columbus and was grateful to have work near her family. The back room at Hazel's was hers on a proper lease now, built out with the pine shelving I'd made last November and a second set I'd built in February when the space started feeling too small. My dad came for Sunday dinners most weeks. He and Linda had a rapport that didn't require me at all. They talked about soil and dogs and Indiana history and a particular pie recipe that she had right and he had been trying to replicate for years. He looked better than he had since before the stroke. The physical therapy had done something real for him, and the dinners had done something else that I couldn't quite name, which was to give him a reason to keep his good days going. "You're quiet," Linda said. "Just thinking," I said. "About what?" I thought about how to answer that, about the road and what it had given me and what it had taken, and about March mornings driving east toward Louisville with the sun coming up red and orange over the highway and the whole country wide open in front of me, about the man I'd been, good at moving and not much else, about the drive here, I said. She looked at me sideways. "To Millhaven?" "In general," I said, "the whole drive." She was quiet for a moment. Then she leaned her head against my shoulder, the way she'd started doing. It had worked its way from that fluorescent-lit hospital waiting room into the permanent furniture of our life. "Where'd you end up?" she asked. I looked at the elm tree and the porch boards that needed replacing and the street beyond the yard where Millhaven was waking up into a Saturday morning. I thought about that amber porch light, left on, always on, the small visible sign of something waiting. "Right here," I said. She took my hand. We sat there on the porch together, and the morning came on slowly the way good things do, and down the street somebody's kid was on a bike, and the elm tree moved in the light wind off the fields, and it was quiet and specific and mine, and I thought, some roads end, some roads arrive. That's all I know. That's everything.